This is breaking news out of Washington. And what just happened inside the United States Senate is extraordinary. The President of the United States just watched members of his own Republican Party join an effort to kill his strategic initiative before it could even begin. And within minutes of that vote, he turned on them publicly, launching an open attack against senators from his own governing coalition and transforming what had been a policy disagreement into a full-blown institutional crisis, the likes of which Washington has rarely witnessed. This was not Democrats blocking a Republican president. This was Republicans standing up in the Senate chamber and saying no to their own party leader. If developments like this matter to you, hit subscribe right now because this story is evolving fast. And what happens next could reshape the balance of power in American government for years to come. Let me walk you through exactly what happened because every detail matters. Washington, District of Columbia, 10:26 in the morning. Inside the United States Senate, lawmakers executed what many are already describing as a procedural strike, a rare legislative maneuver that abruptly halted a strategic initiative being pushed by the president himself. The Senate opened an emergency procedural vote tied to what had been described as a Greenland initiative. The resolution was narrow in structure but devastating in effect. Its purpose was straightforward: block the federal government from using any federal funds to pursue official steps connected to the Greenland Plan. No negotiation teams, no administrative preparation, no financial groundwork. If the resolution held, the entire initiative would be frozen before it ever reached a formal negotiation stage. And that is exactly what happened. The vote passed decisively. The Greenland Initiative was stopped dead at the legislative level before any official diplomatic phase could even begin. Now, here is the detail that stunned Washington and shifted the temperature across Capitol Hill. It was not just opposition lawmakers who supported the bloc. Multiple senators from the president's own party voted to shut the plan down. Let me say that again because the weight of it needs to land properly. Members of the president's own Republican Party joined the effort to halt his initiative using the machinery of Congress against their own president. That is the moment this stopped being routine politics and became something far more serious. Because when intra-party resistance rises to the level of a procedural blockade inside the Senate, it signals something deeper than a policy disagreement. It signals that a governing coalition may be fracturing inside the institutional machinery of government. Minutes after the vote closed, the Office of Senate Leadership issued an official statement confirming that the Senate had passed a binding budgetary resolution tied to the Greenland Initiative. The language was precise and devastating. Under the resolution, federal agencies were instructed to halt all financial and administrative preparations connected to the plan. No agency spending, no logistical groundwork, no operational preparation of any kind. The confrontation immediately stopped being hypothetical and became procedural reality. Then the escalation hit. Within minutes of the Senate confirming the resolution, the president issued a statement sharply criticizing several senators from his own party. The White House viewed the move not merely as disagreement, but as direct obstruction of a presidential initiative. That response changed the entire atmosphere inside Washington because the moment a president publicly attacks members of his own coalition, the political system shifts from internal negotiation to open institutional warfare. Senate leaders responded immediately. An emergency press briefing was assembled. Senior lawmakers stepped in front of cameras and defended the vote as a necessary institutional safeguard. They framed the action not as rebellion against the president, but as an exercise of congressional responsibility. Almost simultaneously, several congressional committees began discussing the possibility of oversight hearings connected to the Greenland proposal. Consider the speed of that sequence. A presidential initiative is blocked. The president fires back publicly. Congressional leaders step forward to justify the block. Committees begin considering formal hearings. That entire chain unfolded within a remarkably short window, transforming what had been framed as a policy debate into a structural confrontation inside the federal power system. Now let me explain why this goes far deeper than Greenland itself, because the constitutional mechanics at play here are critical for everyone to understand. Under the American constitutional structure, the president holds primary authority in several critical domains: shaping foreign policy direction, directing national strategic priorities, and launching international negotiation initiatives. Those powers are not symbolic. They are core elements of executive authority. But the Senate deployed one of the most powerful tools Congress possesses to counter those powers: budgetary control. By restricting federal funding connected to the initiative, lawmakers effectively constructed a procedural wall around the entire plan. Without funding, initiatives simply cannot move forward. The institutional arguments from both sides carry genuine constitutional weight, and that is precisely what makes this confrontation so complex. Senate leadership issued a clear argument grounded in oversight. Lawmakers insisted the resolution was not aimed at the president personally, but was designed to protect congressional authority over major strategic initiatives that could lead to financial obligations, diplomatic agreements, or national commitments. Their position rests on a long-standing principle that Congress must retain the ability to review and control initiatives before they create binding obligations. The White House response pointed in a fundamentally different direction. Administration officials emphasized that foreign policy direction sits primarily within presidential authority. The executive branch leads diplomacy. The president launches negotiations and directs strategic engagement. Congress may approve or reject final agreements, but the early stages of exploration have traditionally been shaped by the executive without congressional interference. That fundamental disagreement produces the central constitutional question now consuming every corridor of Washington. Who controls the first move? Is it the president launching strategic initiatives through executive authority, or Congress using its financial power to freeze those initiatives before they ever gain momentum? This question reaches far beyond Greenland. It touches the structural mechanics of how power operates between the branches of American government. Here is what makes this situation historically unusual and why observers are using the phrase institutional stress test. Most clashes between Congress and the president in American history occurred between opposing political parties. A president from one party facing a Congress dominated by another. That is where institutional friction traditionally emerges. What we are witnessing now is structurally different. The confrontation is unfolding inside the same governing coalition. A sitting president watching members of his own party use Senate machinery against his initiative. Once a power conflict moves inside a single party, the normal dynamics of negotiation break down. There are fewer predictable alliances, fewer clear political lanes, and far less historical precedent to guide anyone toward resolution. The internal power map inside the Republican Party has fractured visibly. One faction has aligned with congressional institutional authority, arguing the legislative branch must retain the ability to control initiatives that could create national commitments before any diplomatic process begins. Another faction continues supporting the White House position, warning that restricting the president at such an early stage weakens executive capacity to conduct foreign policy. That division is no longer hidden behind closed doors. It is playing out in public statements, committee conversations, and across every corridor of Capitol Hill. Constitutional scholars are now examining three major questions that could define how this confrontation evolves. First, how binding is the Senate resolution? If federal agencies are prohibited from spending on the initiative, the practical impact is significant, but some analysts are asking whether the executive branch could continue activities that do not involve direct spending. Second, could the president pursue non-budgetary preparation, such as internal policy analysis, diplomatic consultation, or strategic planning that does not draw on restricted funds? That possibility is being debated among legal observers right now. Third, Congress may not stop with this resolution. Lawmakers could introduce formal legislation expanding the restrictions dramatically. If that happens, the institutional conflict widens into territory that could take years to resolve. Three possible paths are emerging from this confrontation, and each one leads in a dramatically different direction. The first path is political compromise. Quiet negotiations between the White House and Senate leadership could produce a modified version of the initiative that satisfies congressional concerns while preserving executive authority. Both sides could claim institutional victory without forcing a deeper confrontation. The second path is legislative escalation. Congress could move beyond the current resolution and begin drafting stronger statutory limits, introducing comprehensive legislation that tightens restrictions on funding and administrative preparation. If that occurs, the confrontation between the branches becomes significantly more formal and significantly more dangerous. The third path is institutional stalemate. Neither side backs down. The White House holds its position on executive authority. Congress maintains its funding restrictions. The issue remains unresolved inside the machinery of government. And that possibility carries its own profound consequences because prolonged stalemates reshape how institutions interact with each other. They change the expectations of future presidents. They alter how Congress deploys its procedural tools. And over time, they quietly redraw the operational boundaries of federal power, in ways that affect governance for generations. Every procedural step from this point forward carries enormous weight. Will congressional committees schedule emergency hearings connected to the Greenland proposal? Will the White House signal it intends to continue exploring the initiative despite funding restrictions? Will senior party leadership intervene quietly to prevent further escalation? Each development pushes the system in a different direction. The next significant move may not come from a dramatic speech or press conference. It may come from a procedural decision buried inside a committee agenda that receives little public attention but reshapes the institutional balance of power permanently. The system-level implications are now hovering over Washington with real gravity. If Congress successfully blocks the early stages of a foreign policy initiative using budget authority, it strengthens legislative leverage in every future strategic debate between the branches. But if the executive branch finds ways to continue pursuing initiatives despite those restrictions, the balance tilts in the opposite direction toward broader presidential discretion that could make congressional oversight increasingly difficult to enforce. Now step back and look at the larger frame, because this confrontation reveals something that extends far beyond any single proposal about any single territory. What is actually being tested here are three fundamental pillars of the American governing system. First, who controls the initiation of foreign policy ideas? Second, how far Congress can use budget authority to block executive action before formal agreements exist? Third, where exactly the line sits between executive initiative and legislative oversight. Those questions do not have simple answers, and they will not be resolved quickly. But the answers that emerge from this confrontation will shape how power operates in Washington for years and potentially decades to come. Both sides are operating within legitimate constitutional frameworks. Both sides are invoking real institutional powers embedded in the founding structure of American government. And that is precisely why this situation has become so extraordinarily complex. This is not a dispute over who has power. It is a dispute over how far that power reaches, where it begins and where it ends, and whether the boundaries that have been assumed for generations are actually as settled as everyone in Washington once believed. Right now, those boundaries look far less certain than they did before this morning's vote. The confrontation has already moved beyond a single proposal. What began as a strategic idea tied to Greenland has triggered a much larger institutional test that touches the constitutional foundations of how the American government functions. Washington is watching a question unfold that is far more consequential than any single policy initiative. What happens when the executive branch attempts to launch a foreign policy concept and Congress decides to kill it before the first official step is even taken? The answer to that question will not merely determine the fate of one proposal. It may define the real boundary between presidential authority and congressional power for an entire generation of American governance. And right now, that boundary is being redrawn in real time inside the halls of the United States Capitol.